My name is Rachel, and I need to unburden myself of something that has weighed on my heart for far too long. Please, before you pass judgment, hear my story. I never imagined I'd be caught in such a situation, and even now, I struggle to comprehend how things unraveled so swiftly. This memory has haunted me for years, a moment that changed everything. It's about something my husband, John, compelled me to do, something that altered the trajectory of my life. It began a few years ago. John and I have been married for nearly a decade. Like any couple, we'd had our share of highs and lows, but I never could have foreseen what was to come. John had always been a caring man, but over time, he began to change. He grew distant, more controlling, and his affection for me seemed to wane. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to work stress, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, John came home from work in an unusually cheerful mood. Yet, beneath his upbeat demeanor, there was something unsettling in the way he looked at me. After dinner, as I was clearing the dishes, he asked me to sit down. His serious tone set my heart racing. I could sense this wasn't going to be a routine conversation. "I've been thinking," he began, avoiding my gaze. "There's something I need to talk to you about." I nodded, bracing myself, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. He said he wanted to bring some excitement back into our relationship, that he'd been feeling bored, and it was time to try something new. At first, I thought he meant a vacation or maybe couples therapy, but his actual suggestion left me frozen. "I've arranged for us to meet two men," he said matter-of-factly. "They're coming over this weekend." I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Was this a joke? Some kind of twisted test? But the look on his face told me he was dead serious. "What do you mean, two men?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "They're friends of mine," he said casually, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "We'll spend the night with them." The room seemed to spin as nausea churned in my stomach. This wasn't my husband, not the man I'd vowed to love and cherish. He was talking about inviting strangers into our home, into our marriage, as if it were nothing. The mere thought made me feel sick, but worse than that, I felt betrayed. "Are you out of your mind, John?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with disbelief and anger. "This isn't us. How could you even suggest something like this?" Before I could finish, he cut me off. "Rachel, this is happening," he said firmly. "You need to understand, it's something I want, something we need." I was stunned. I told him no, that I wouldn't go through with it, hoping that would be the end of the discussion. But I was wrong. In the days that followed, John became more distant. He barely spoke to me except to bring up the plan. And when I asked where he'd been when he came home late, his answers were vague. Our once loving conversations were replaced by tense silences. The warmth of our home had been replaced by a cold, suffocating atmosphere. By Friday, dread had settled deep within me. John was adamant that the meeting would happen, no matter how much I protested. I thought about leaving, about packing my bags and walking away from it all. But a part of me clung to the hope that the man I once knew was still in there somewhere. I wasn't ready to throw away everything we'd built, even though the idea of going through with this plan filled me with dread. Saturday arrived too soon. The men, John's so-called friends, arrived promptly at 8 p.m. I sat on the couch, my hands clenched tightly in my lap as I fought back tears. I didn't even know their names, yet here they were, sitting in my living room, chatting with my husband like old friends. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to disappear, to run out of the house and never look back. But then John leaned over, placing a hand on my knee. "Rachel, it's time," he said softly. I froze. My mind screamed at me to get up and leave, but my body wouldn't move. His hand felt like a heavy weight, anchoring me in place. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, or the two men seated across from me. My heart pounded in my chest as the room seemed to close in around me. "Please, Rachel," John said again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. There was something in his tone that made me pause, a note of desperation I hadn't heard before. For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't about fulfilling some twisted fantasy for him. It was about control, power, and something deeper that I couldn't fully grasp. But no matter what it wasn't right. None of this felt right. "I can't do this, John," I finally whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't who we are." He let out a heavy sigh, sinking back into his chair and rubbing his temples in frustration. "You think I want this?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I'm doing this for us, Rachel. Don't you see that?" "No, you're not," I shot back, finding a small spark of courage. "This is for you. You've changed, John. This isn't about us anymore. It's about control." For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but it vanished quickly. Instead, he clenched his jaw, stood up, and began pacing the room like a man who had lost his way. I wanted to reach out, to pull him back, to restore the man I once loved, but I didn't know how. We were so far from where we had begun, and I wasn't sure if we could ever find our way back. The silence between us was unbearable until one of the men, let's call him Marcus, cleared his throat. He seemed to sense the tension, but carried an air of impatience. "Look," he said, his voice steady but firm, "if this isn't going to happen, we should probably leave." I looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. He wasn't what I expected. Calm, respectful, and surprisingly sympathetic. His demeanor was the opposite of what I had imagined. I had built up an image of these men as predators, but they were just people, and somehow that made the situation even more confusing. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to be part of whatever this had turned into, but the weight of everything, the years with John, the love we had once shared, the lingering hope that maybe things could go back to how they were, kept me rooted to that spot. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, suffocated by my indecision. Then John spoke again, his voice quieter but unwavering. "Rachel, if you leave, we're done." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him in disbelief, struggling to process what he had just said. He had drawn a line in the sand, and now I had to choose which side to stand on. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let him see me crumble. "I've given you everything," he continued, his voice cold yet steady. "I provided for you, loved you, and this is the one thing I'm asking for in return." I stood up, my legs shaky but resolute. "This isn't love, John," I whispered, barely able to speak. "This is manipulation." His eyes flared with anger, but I didn't care anymore. I couldn't do this. I wouldn't do this. I turned toward the door, expecting him to yell, to grab me, to try and stop me, but he didn't. Instead, I heard him mutter under his breath, something like, "You'll regret this." Maybe I would. Maybe leaving was a mistake, but in that moment, I knew I had to walk away. I couldn't let John or anyone force me into something I wasn't comfortable with. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak washed over me. My legs carried me down the street, my mind racing. Where would I go? What would I do? I had no answers, only a deep sense of betrayal and loss. I wandered for what felt like hours before I found myself standing in front of my best friend Sarah's house. I knocked on the door, praying she was home. When she opened it and saw my tear-streaked face, she didn't ask a single question. She just pulled me into a tight hug and led me inside. Over the next few days, I stayed with Sarah, trying to process everything that had happened. I felt empty, as if a part of me had been torn away. I missed John, but I also knew I couldn't go back. The damage was done, and there was no repairing what had been broken. John tried calling me several times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry. His emotions were all over the place, and I couldn't keep up. I didn't answer any of his calls, and eventually he stopped trying. Months passed, and I slowly began to rebuild my life. I filed for divorce, knowing that our marriage was beyond saving. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but in the end, I knew it was the right one. I couldn't stay in a relationship where I was being manipulated and forced into situations that went against everything I believed in. I still think about John sometimes, about the life we could have had if things had been different. But I've come to realize that I deserve better. I deserve a love based on trust, respect, and mutual understanding, not control and manipulation.